able to join, but who will be able to watch this webinar afterwards. Welcome to our Advocacy 101 training. We have a wonderful conversation today with former lawmakers Mike Kuglitsch and John Erpenbach. I'll give a bit of a bio on them, but mostly just want to welcome people to the conversation. Joining, we have the panelists as well as community health center advocates, volunteers, staff from locations across Wisconsin. So thank you all for joining today. Our hope is to have a candid discussion with Mike and John about what it was like to serve in the Wisconsin legislature, chat a little bit about kind of effective advocacy strategies when they're working with groups like community health centers or other stakeholders who are trying to work through legislative processes and build relationships with lawmakers. So let me just check in and see, are there any logistical issues or questions for me before we dive into our webinar today? I'm seeing none. We do have the chat available for you. So for folks, if you have questions as they come up, feel free to add those into the chat. Otherwise, we will have some time for open discussion. Our format here, we've prepared a few questions for John and Mike, but we also want to hear from all of you to understand from community health center folks what you'd like to learn more about. So our panel, Mike and John. Mike served in the Wisconsin Assembly for 12 years, first elected in 2010. Chaired the State Affairs, Energy and Utilities Committee. Now is a principal with Michael Best Strategies. That's a consulting firm that WIPCA also works with for some of our lobbying and advocacy work. Originally from the Waukesha County area, Mike. Anything else that you'd care to share about us in terms of background here today? You've just somewhat recently retired from the Wisconsin legislature, is that right?
Yeah, basically in May of this past year, I resigned, and then in June, I joined the government relations side of the business with Michael Best Strategies. Prior to that, I was a small business owner and legislator in the assembly for 11 and a half years, technically.
Well, we look forward to hearing from you, Mike. Great experience. And John Erpenbach, thank you so much for joining us too. John served 6 terms in the Wisconsin Senate, including as the Democratic leader from 2003 to 2005, leadership on the Budget Writing Joint Finance Committee, elected around the same time, 1998, hailing from Middleton here on the west side of Dane County, Madison area. And then John, I know you're recently appointed to chair the Wisconsin Parole Commission, which is also an exciting new thing to do for you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Anything else you think folks should know before we dive into the conversation?
No, other than serving as a Democratic leader was probably the worst 2 years I had at the Capitol. Mike can attest to this. Leadership is, well, it blows at times. Be quite honest with you. But I know the new job I'm doing now, chair of the Parole Commission, is interesting. It's a really fascinating situation, and nothing I had planned on doing. I actually had my retirement papers in, and then got a call from the administration to see if I would be interested in it, and looked into it and am. So I am really looking forward to the challenge.
Thank you for stepping up into continued service role. We'll appreciate both of you joining us today. So I've prepared a handful of questions for them, but happy to have a ranging conversation here. Mostly just want to kind of humanize policymakers a little bit. I think for a lot of advocates, it can be kind of scary to go and meet with a legislator. Hopefully it's someone that represents you, but just kind of understanding that you all as former policymakers are, real people who are have a wide range of experiences and knowledge. So I guess if I could just ask you to start with, when we set up meetings with community health center advocates to go and meet with their legislators, would be interested to hear from each of you. What are some of the things that have gone really well in those meetings for you in the past? And if you have any kind of tips or tricks to avoid, we'd be interested to know those too. Mike, maybe we could start with you just to understand a little bit about that from your background. So when you're meeting with someone, what do you look for? What do you want to know about them? How do those meetings go well in your experience? And certainly in your experience now, kind of from the policy advocacy side of you, would be interested to learn that too.
So first off, if someone walked into my office when I was a legislator, I kind of had a little bit of an expectation that they knew a little bit about my background, right? That I came from the private sector, maybe a business owner, and also have an expectation of my district, in where I come. And then, because based on your district and it kind of lends to your political makeup, right? Based on how your district. So I kind of had that expectation that they at least knew coming into my office. And then one of the big tips, and I'm sure John has had these, and because we have, is that if someone comes into your office, you hope it doesn't turn into an argument, or that people are preventive, right? I mean, be passionate about what your advocacy is, but stay away from getting into arguments. Find the need, and then present a solution. Sometimes people would walk in and kind of expect that there's going to be agreement. So, kind of understand that you're going to come in, define your need, and then present a solution.
And is there, do you have a moment you can recall in your past, Mike, where some of those conversations kind of went off the rails or got off topic, and how an advocate can kind of bring that back? How do you avoid some of that argument when maybe it's a nature of the issue that you're trying to work? For example, we serve a lot of Medicaid patients, and sometimes Medicaid can be a little bit of a sticky topic around the Capitol these days. How do you recommend that advocates address an issue that there might be disagreement on?
Well, I think that's just kind of the mindset that you're going to have as an advocate walking into an office, is that not everybody's going to see it the same way as you, but lay out, a good persuasive case as to, how individuals in their district would benefit, right? So, and I think when someone would come into my office, I would look under the lens of my constituents, because as a state rep, it's in my title, right? I represent my district. So I would try to take the personal emotion away and look at how does this help my constituents.
Thank you, Mike. John, certainly would be interested to hear the same kind of what's gone well in the past on some of those meetings, and any kind of pitfalls to avoid.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, legislators I know, and I know Mike, but I don't know Mike well, so I'm not going to put Mike in this category. Legislators, they just like to talk. Odds are you probably know more about the issue you're dealing with than the legislator does. Legislators know a little bit about a lot of stuff. I mean, that's what we were supposed to do. I tend to know more about Medicaid and Medicaid expansion than I think most legislators, because I've worked on it for a million years unsuccessfully at the Capitol. The most important thing advocates can do is put a face on what you're talking about. Don't talk numbers and nuts and bolts as much as you might want to talk about examples of people you're representing, and how Medicaid expansion might help them, or how this piece of legislation might you understand the intentions of it, but it might not have the kind of impact I think that a legislator might be looking for. I don't know, but the most important thing is to humanize whatever it is you're talking about. So the legislator also has to hopefully be open to what you're talking about. There are legislators who just Medicaid, for example, won't expand it no matter what. But at the same time, it's important that they do hear from you, and what it's like to be on Medicaid, which, you know, it's nothing anybody grows up and aspires to. But yet, you know, there's a reason why it's there. And there's a reason why it should be expanded, because, you know, if you're making more than minimum wage, you're not eligible for Medicaid, which, again, you know, on the issue itself boggles my mind. But and then the other thing is that, you know, Mike talked about combative stuff. You know, what you're talking about isn't combative. There are other issues that can be combative, and it's just as much up to the legislator to try and kind of keep the peace in the room during the discussion when you're meeting with the advocates, as it is the individual coming into the office. Other than that, you know, you can talk about how Medicaid expansion positively could impact a district, because there are people, you know, it's not just an inner city urban issue. It's you know, people in rural areas struggling with this issue right now. And yet a lot of the opposition on Medicaid expansion tends to come from rural legislators, which is interesting. At least that's the history I've had with it over the course of time. But just keep in mind, you know more probably than the legislator does, and put a face on it. You know, talk about the people you represent. Don't talk about the numbers you represent.
I appreciate that, John. Some of the work that we do is looking at dental access issues and improving access to behavioral health services for people in rural communities and urban. You know, maybe issues that haven't been on a legislator's mind. You know, maybe they've always had great access to a dentist, and so thinking about folks that maybe haven't been able to find a dentist, or uninsured, or if they're enrolled in the Medicaid program. How do you and, you know, something that we try to work with our advocates to do is really elevate an issue with policymakers, so that maybe we don't have a solution in place, but we're trying to let them know that this is a problem. Could either of you, and I'm going a little bit off script here just because I think you both posed some ideas for me that I want to follow up on. How do you kind of help a legislator pay more attention to an issue that may not be on their radar? What are some of the, either in your own experience as a legislator, something maybe something that wasn't on your radar, you weren't paying attention to, that changed over time? Have you experienced that? How can we help legislators pay more attention to something that they're not currently spending time on? John, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. One thing you can do, and there's success to a point on this, dental, just access to dentists anywhere. The Dental Association got together and really pushed hard on the legislature, not only to increase Medicaid reimbursement rates when it comes to services, but try and get access, especially into more rural areas. And so the association took it upon themselves to deal with the legislature in conjunction with other advocacy groups, and they were fairly successful. And a lot of it is, you know, you're fighting for attention right now, probably more so than any other point in the 2-year cycle, because of the budget and what's going on with that right now. If you're going to expand Medicaid, it's going to be in the budget. It's not going to be anywhere else. So you are also competing with everybody else who wants a part of the budget or has a stake in the budget. And you're talking about road builders, you're talking about environmental groups, you're talking everybody, A to Z right now. And so the legislature right now, if you can get a meeting with the legislator, that's great. Don't be afraid to settle with for some staffers if the legislator is busy, depending on committee assignments and stuff like that. But just keep in mind, you're in competition with everybody else right now. And what you're working for and what you're advocating for is just as important as what the road builders are advocating for. It's all extremely important, the groups that everybody represents. So getting the attention of a legislator is right now during the budget cycle is a little difficult. But at the same time, the legislator has a responsibility to sit down and talk with you, ask you questions, try and get some answers, and hopefully work with you on whatever issue you might be dealing with at the time. But it's, you know, it's the halls are busy at the Capitol right now.
Thanks, John. Any experience, Mike, from your end on that, kind of how to elevate an issue? That's something that happens over time, usually in a one-off. Kind of talk us through that a little bit, how to help policymakers kind of understand that something not on their radar might be an area where they need to pay more attention?
So it's interesting. John brought up a good point about Medicaid reimbursement for dentists, right? The percentage. And that's a prime example. I mean, blessed, I've had dental insurance my whole life, so I never had an issue, but it was an issue. And the Dental Association really doubled down by getting their local dentists involved. And they contacted the legislators, and then we had, they invited us to their offices. So they gave us the tour of their offices. You had direct contact with dentists that were constituents of yours. And then you kind of, I want to say, appreciated the topic more, but you gave it more emphasis, because these were your constituents. That not only were the individuals being served by the dentist, but the dentists were your constituents. And I think John will agree that if there's an issue that is affecting your constituents and you hear about it and they're engaged, you become more engaged. So I think if you can tie that to, if it's tours in your district, you have to get the legislator out of his office in Madison and into his district. And if you can take what you are advocating for into the district level and make those, I think, as John mentioned earlier, and humanize it, I think that's how you get more engagement by the legislator.
I've definitely spoken with lawmakers that have recalled a visit to a community health center they had years ago as something that's really transformed their experience thinking about an issue, or that kind of helped really inspire a relationship that grew over time. John, would you recommend that too? Kind of get into the trenches of the community for those visits, spend time kind of sitting down over a cup of coffee, seeing things kind of in action. Has that been effective for you?
Yeah, it has. And that's something I've always done. But I'll take it a step further. If there was an issue, a statewide issue that didn't necessarily have an impact on my district, I would still make it a point to get to wherever and tour something outside of my district, because again, I represented the 27th Senate district, but the votes I had a statewide impact. Voting on things, especially while working on finance, voting on things, excuse me, that again didn't really have an impact on my district. I still went and visited wherever it was. So Eau Claire, La Crosse, Green Bay, whatever, Milwaukee. So we do that too. And it's the balance that we had, that Mike and I had, was, yep, we represent our districts, and yep, we listen to our constituents. You know how you feel on the core issues, and hopefully you're honest with your constituents about it, and either tell them, look, this is just the way I feel about issue A, and if we agree, great. If we don't, let's figure out a way to get there. If we can't, let's drop it and move on. But there are so many more issues that aren't like that. They, are issues that, again, my vote would have an impact on where Mike represented, just as much as his vote had an impact on where I represented. So it's important for the legislator to understand that. And, any legislator who would say to you, well, no, that, this isn't an issue in my district, and still won't sit down and talk with you, to me, that's kind of irresponsible, because his or her vote has an impact on the state and then other parts of the state. So we got to kind of be selfish, but we also have to keep an eye on the big picture, which is the state of Wisconsin.
So I appreciate that note, that there are so many issues that kind of don't fall into those big kind of political fight categories. And those things are often kind of happening at more of a simmer level, aren't getting much attention. I'm curious kind of what pique your interest on a topic, hearing from constituents. Is that thing to kind of get you to either co-sponsor legislation or kind of influence your vote on something, do you have to hear from a lot of people about it over a long time? Does, one really impactful conversation ever matter? Kind of how do you decide how you act on some of these policy issues as they come up? What are the factors that really influence the outcomes for some of the non-political stuff that happens every day? Mike, any thoughts from you would be great on that. Kind of what's influenced how you've acted on something?
I would say there's a number of different things that went into that decision, but a lot of times it's just personal interest. Do you have a personal interest in that topic? Is it maybe something from your past? Is it something that you have a personal interest? So I was a small business guy, so I gravitated towards business issues, economic development. So first I would, through that lens, would be kind of my personal interest. And then I would go to, okay, is this issue affect my district, right? Is there a district benefit for this? And then, which would be some people's first reason for acting, but it was more my last, is there a political reason that I may pursue legislation? As John said earlier, at the end of the day, we were blessed because we were basically problem solvers for the state of Wisconsin. And different people, viewed that differently. I was always, yes, I had an R next to my name, but I looked at it as I want to be pragmatic, come up with a solution for the state of Wisconsin. And that benefits my constituents. And, if I have a personal interest in that, then that would basically, that would kind of direct me to that issue.
Thanks, Mike. What about you, John? What were the factors that influence how you would either vote or engage on a policy matter?
Well, I mean, it's my responsibility to, and every legislator's response was, I gotta get used to that. It was my responsibility to make sure that I got every bit of information I possibly could get before making a decision on an issue that I was unsure on. I would pick up the phone and I would call some folks in the district who might be impacted more so than others on any particular piece of legislation. I would talk to other legislators whose district this would have an impact on more than mine. I would talk to the legislator sponsor and saying, okay, what's the backstory on this? You always hope that you do the right thing, not only for your district, but for the state. As somebody who'd been in the minority for quite a while and in the majority for a while, the easiest thing to do as a legislator is to say no to something. The toughest thing to do is say no, but let's see how we can kind of get there and try and work together on whatever the issue might be, and make whatever was introduced better. Anything you can do in a bipartisan fashion is a good thing. And, in the Senate, when there's a lot of, 33-0 votes or 32-1, because there's always that one who will vote no, that's really successful. And most of what we voted on was like that. Probably 90% of everything we voted on had pretty strong bipartisan support in both houses. It's that 10%, the Medicaid expansion, stuff like that we tend to debate over, fight over, that kind of stuff. But it's the legislator's responsibility to listen to the people affected, do research on it, and not be selfish, and recognize the fact that each district isn't surrounded by glass walls. We're all one state. And whether I think this, I might not think it's a great idea, but I certainly could understand how it could help. I'd vote for something like that. If it's something that I think is just awful, then again, my job is not just to say no, but to try and find a way to get from awful to okay.
Well, I'm hearing in your comments there too, it's for all the policymakers kind of knowing who to call to ask, does this affect you? You know, what are the impacts on the district? And, you know, and I have the privilege of serving in the government relations role for WIPCA. So I try to make myself available state legislators as issues come up. But I'm also hearing that the more an advocate can have an established relationship with the legislator, the more that legislator might think of them. Oh, you're in healthcare. This bill came across my desk. Does this impact you? Would this be a positive change for your work? Does it matter at all? Does that ring true for you, John? Kind of having those relationships that you go to when particular bills come across your desk? Is that important?
Yeah, it is. With the advocates, with the lobbyists, like if something's coming up in the medical community, call the hospital association, call the medical society, and talk with their representatives and say, okay, what does this mean? Does this limit scope? Does it expand scope? What does this do for rural areas? What does it do for urban areas? And so, yeah, I mean, it obviously it helps. And in your specific role, people know you, and they're going to call you, whether it's a legislator or staff, either or, just to do a little more research on the legislation. But yeah, relationships are important. And, some of the better relationships I had with lobbyists and advocates were people I didn't agree with, but I actually enjoyed spending more time talking with people that I don't agree with than people that I do, because it expands, my thinking, and it expands my ability to look at an issue a very different way than I normally would, or I'm used to that kind of tunnel vision thing. But yeah, having familiar faces and names to call on issues, it's an important thing, and it's something I did all the time.
Mike, how would you see those relationships getting built over time effectively? Those more casual conversations, or people coming into your office, once a year for a visit? How would you build those relationships with your local kind of constituent group, so that when there is a question that comes up, you're aware of who to go to, who's got a stake in that? What's been successful to build those?
So I have to apologize. You froze up when you're asking the question to John. So could you, was that tied to the first question? Because I didn't quite hear that.
Sorry about that, Mike. Interested to know how relationships were built over time successfully for you as a policymaker with your local constituents on different policy issues. What are the ways that people were able to build those relationships with you in the long term?
So I would say multiple relationships, and that when you come into the legislature, you have your kind of core understanding, or your core, beliefs and expertise. And then, as John mentioned earlier, we have to learn a lot about everything. So, you develop trust, and that's through just, counting on, if it's government relations people, if it's someone from your district, it's a resource that can help you understand the topic better. And those relationships are built with trust. That and unfortunately, there's some relationships that end because you lose that trust. So I would recommend that if someone asks questions, you get back to them with an answer. If they're looking for information, be that resource to them, and then just be honest, and a lot of times just offer the facts, and then you build that trust, and that's becomes the long-term relationship, that when there is an issue, that you can go to that person, you can trust them, and that's really, I mean, I'll tell you this, over my 12 years, and John longer, is there's people that you counted on and you went to them because you knew you were going to get an honest answer. And then you unfortunately have learned over time that there's certain individuals you don't go to. So I would just say, it's like any other relationship. Building trust is being honest, being there for the individual, being a resource.
I'm also hearing, that follow through is really important. And also, something I really try to do a lot is, not exaggerate my solution and just try to put it into context of this is a part of the solution to an issue, or it'll have a big impact, or it'll be moderate, or kind of thinking through kind of how it fits into the bigger overall package. I'm also wondering, kind of in those experiences, sometimes, maybe there's a good idea, but the timing's not right, or there isn't the coalition built around an idea. How much does politics eventually play into moving an idea forward? I think that it's, in my experience working in the Capitol, it's an inevitable part of the machine. Is there are some things that just kind of fall into political categories. Oh, and I do see some comments coming in the chat here. So we'll get to those questions in a moment here. Thank you so much. Please keep adding them in. That's great. How much does politics play into what happens in the Capitol? And there are ways to get through those kind of political roadblocks. What's your experience there, John? I know it varies issue to issue.
It does vary issue to issue. When you talk about politics, it's more so caucus pressure, meaning the Democratic caucus or the Republican caucus in either house going in behind closed doors to try and get enough votes for something, or to try and talk people out of voting for something. So that's kind of where the politics come into play there, more so than anything. I'm going to give you an example of something that has a lot of traction right now, and in this state, it took 20 years at least to get there. Medical marijuana. The advocates never stopped. There is bipartisan support for it now, although it's not strong, but it's something where the advocates kept coming back year after year after year after year. And the more legislators were educated and the more they listened to some of their constituents, the more they said, okay, hey, this might be an okay thing. So politics isn't coming into play on this one. It doesn't. And politics doesn't come into play on a lot of stuff. And part of that has to do that legislators on both sides of the aisle are pretty entrenched in their district. And while Medicaid expansion, for example, certainly might make a lot of sense financially, just forget the fact that it's the right thing to do. Like, the amount of money that would come into the state is pretty staggering. The amount of money that we passed up by not expanding is just as staggering. But, there'll be legislators who are so entrenched in their district because of redistricting that politics won't really matter of it. The perception of it won't really matter. If they're going to vote no, they're going to vote no. And it's not going to affect them in an upcoming election. So the politics of it really more so is the internal pressure within the building to try and sway legislators one way or the other on, whatever the issue might be.
What's your experience with that, Mike? I know it feels, at least when I talk to colleagues who are working in, a lobbying role, that sometimes it feels like this plays more of a role today than it used to. Do you think that's true? How would it kind of determine you would engage on issues?
Well, I'll tell you, that's one of the reasons I left the legislature. It just became too political, which sounds kind of bizarre because it's called politics. But because from my standpoint, I just wanted to solve problems. And I think when you first come in, you're probably more politically driven. And then the longer you stay, the more I think you become an advocate to actually solve the problems. The problem that I see right now is that there's the politics between the R and the D, but then there's actually politics within the R's and there's politics within the D. I think there would be a lot more legislators that would be willing to work in the middle if they didn't have the political pressure from within their party, and that's unfortunate, because at the end of the day, there's, you know, the good answer is somewhere in the middle, but unfortunately, because of politics, both sides of the aisle, you know, are living on the fringe. So with that pressure, you know, there are some lawmakers that will strictly vote based on politics of an issue, and you know, or they vote the political wind of their district because they may be afraid to not vote that way for election time, which to me, that's unfortunate. So I know I kind of went off point there, but you know, there are politics, and I think that's why if you stick to what the issue is, what is the need, what is the solution, and problem solving, we can hopefully eliminate some of the challenges that individuals that are strictly looking through the lens of politics.
I appreciate that a lot. And kind of also just hearing that a big part of that role from the advocate is just being that honest broker of information and having the knowledge about the context of the issue, so that you're not just walk into an office without any of the kind of background on, might this be a really hot button issue and I don't know it and I'm walking into a hornet's nest about it, or can I kind of showcase how this is a challenge and a solution and kind of talk about the trade-offs of that. I tend to find that when I meet with lawmakers, you know, if I can say, here's part of the solution and it's not perfect and here's why, we can have that real honest conversation. That seems to be really great, so that we're not just saying, this is going to solve all the problems or whatever it is, and kind of having that context for a discussion. I think we'll go to the chat because we've got some great questions here. So question from Julia, how do we advocate for patients or near constituents who may want to bring a concern to their local legislator? You know, WIPCA, we provide some of the resources to help community health center staff or volunteer members do that. But if we've, you know, got a patient at one of our clinics who maybe wants to talk through an issue, what would be some steps to help that patient make a connection? What would you recommend, John? Just give your office a call and make an appointment, or what's the best way to get started?
That's how we dealt with it in our office, is just call, you know, or if I'd run into somebody at grocery store or out at a supper club or wherever the case may be, and they say, I really want to talk to you about this, I just have them call the office, and then, you know, we could do it over the phone, we could do it by Zoom, I can come and meet them, which is what I normally did. I would go and meet them rather than have them come to the Capitol. But that, you know, it's the kind of job that, you know, okay, let's say I was out with the kids when they were younger and we're having dinner, people would come up and talk, and it comes kind of part of the territory. But if you do see a legislator, you know, and you want to talk to them, you know, don't, you know, talk to them in the produce aisle for a half hour. Just say, look, what do I do to set up? And he or she will tell you, just call the office, and that's the best way to do it.
What's your experience with that, Mike? And how much do you know, I'm picturing like so many different issues that a constituent or, you know, a patient at a community health center might want to engage on, anything from, you know, they haven't been able to find affordable childcare to, you know, they got a bone to pick about some environmental regulation. What's the format that you would like someone to reach out to you in, and what should that person know about the topic and kind of share their experience that's most effective?
I would say,
I guess that was two questions in one.
So I would say if someone came, approached me or called, have one or two issues, don't have a laundry list, right? And then, you know, the majority of legislators that I know would call these individuals back or set up a meeting in the district. But a lot of times, you know, you don't know what you don't know. So you need to have that contact. So I would say if there's someone within, your organization that knows of a constituent that has an issue, maybe be that conduit to get them in contact with the legislator. And then again, have the conversation. And I'm sure John has had these, but I mean, where, you make the call and they just start yelling at you. It's like, let's just be adults and have a conversation, and let's try to, work out a solution.
Got a question from Kay here in the chat asking about working with newer lawmakers or inexperienced ones. That's definitely something that we're working through this legislative session. There's if everyone's in their seat, there's 132 132 legislators in the legislature. And this year there's more than 30 new folk in those seats these days. So we've got a lot of new legislators to work with and forge relationships with. How might you, John, maybe I'll start with you on this one. How much you recommend your approach with a seasoned lawmaker? Let's imagine someone who is on joint finance or who's in a leadership position relative to working with a new lawmaker. How might you kind of change the approach as an advocate?
Well, first of all, it'll be hard to get a meeting with a member of finance. I mean, that's kind of a difficult thing to do, and don't be upset if the legislator won't sit down and talk with you. I think it'll be a lot easier to get meetings face to face with newer legislators than it will be with older legislators. There were advocacy groups I would meet every single year, and it would basically be the same thing. We would sit there and we would, agree with each other because it's an issue that we both supported. But they still took the time to come and see me, which was nice. But spend time with people who you agree with. Spend more time with people who don't agree with you. So. Like I say, it'll be easier probably to get a meeting with a newer legislator. They have less when it comes to committee work, less committee assignments. But those legislators who've been there for a while, some will still certainly meet with you, while others probably may not. It just depends on the legislator.
Mike, what's your experience there? Kind of how would you approach well, I guess what you're doing now these days in your role, we've got all these new folks to meet with and kind of establish relationships with. Is that more education for new lawmakers than it is kind of coming in with an ask, or how do you change that engagement?
Well, I think with a new legislator, they're overwhelmed, right? So, I think it's taken baby steps with them. It's that introduction, it's inform, educate, persuade. I mean, those three things of what your organization is about. Now, a more seasoned legislator that may have had these inform, educate, persuade, meetings in the past, I think there you can go more for the ask or, for something more specific. And you're going to find that some of the new legislators, it's going to take multiple visits for them to understand the topic. It's just kind of the way it works, right? So I would say I wouldn't have maybe lower your expectations a little bit when you're going to the new legislators, just because it's a process.
Big fire hose for folks in the
Yes.
Capitol right now, learning a lot, not only the content of the issues, but just how processes work and who's making decisions and how is that happening and timelines. I do think it's really exciting when we can already have a kind of an existing baseline of understanding with a legislator that's frankly often built over many years. I met with a legislator last week, someone who sponsored a bill for the community health centers 2 years ago. And I walked into this individual's office with, I had a little issue that I wanted to raise for him and let him know that it's something that we might want to work on. And he basically said, "What do you need from me? I'll do whatever I can to work on this for you." And that I think was because the community health center in that district over many years had been kind of work with that lawmaker, coming in for visits, checking in, keeping that legislator informed about what they were doing. And that way I didn't have to, build that relationship that was already kind of in place. And it's someone that, represents a rural area that has a really high need. And this legislator has really taken an interest in the clinic. So I appreciate just the note, Mike, that some of these things are really long-term and it can feel like an investment. But I think that makes sense. We all build relationships over time, and doing so with a lawmaker is no different from my experience, at least. Another question, great one in the chat. Are constituents pushing politicians to the corners, or are fellow politicians moving legislators further away from a central place where problem solving can happen? What is your theory of the case here? Is it constituents? Is it legislators? What is sort of putting people perhaps more in their corners now? What do you think about that one? Maybe I'll ask you to start. What are the causes to that experience you had that feels more political these days?
Is that John or me?
I'll start with you.
Oh, okay. So I think, first off, it's the political parties that are pushing people to the corners. And then secondly, it's some of your constituents that are, which I find are usually the boisterous. And when I say minority, I'm not saying the minority party, but it's a smaller group than the majority. And then, there might be some, but not as much as I would say the political parties. There's some pressure from within your caucus. And I agree that if that wasn't there, I think you'd see a lot more problem solving that would encompass both parties.
What do you think, John? Where is that pressure primarily coming from?
Okay, so I'm going to just be really blunt. It's talk radio, talk TV, and redistricting. It's those three things. So what happens, whether it's a Democratic seat or a Republican seat, the more Democratic it becomes or the more Republican it becomes, the more of the extreme of the party tend to make it through a primary. And as a result of that, if you've got a rock solid Republican district and a rock solid Democratic district, and there's 25 people running in a primary, they're trying to out-conservative each other or out-liberal each other. And the one who's deemed by the parties that, okay, this is the one we're back and the most conservative, the most liberal, they'll make it through the primary. And then they'll win the general election. And then they go off to Congress or go off to Madison. And I don't know why people expect us to get along or expect them to get along, because you have extremes. And in the Senate, you put them in a round room and they're supposed to fight it out. So what happens when I talk about talk radio and talk TV, when things become political at the Capitol, it usually means a legislator is worried about losing their seat in a primary. That's what that means. So that's why you will tend to see moderate Democrats take a very liberal vote on something, or moderate Republicans take a very, very conservative vote on something. It's because they don't want to lose their seat in a primary, and that's happened. And it started happening when, on the Republican side, when Glenn Grothman beat Mary Panzer, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, in a primary, because Mary wasn't seen as conservative enough. And that was actually a result of talk radio coming out of Milwaukee. So that's why we are where we are right now politically. But the reality of it is we have so much in common in this state. There's not a lot that divides us yet. We're being told when we turn on talk TV or listen to talk radio that we should be angry, and we are divided and we are so polarized. When you look at the issues, and how legislators on both sides of the aisle tend to vote on that 90 to 92% of the issues, whatever it is, we all agree, even though we're being told we don't agree by the media influencers out there. So that's why we are where we are today, in my opinion.
I think it is kind of a good reminder that there are a lot of external factors in place here in the policymaking process, but I look back at, bills the governor signed last year. Those had to get through Republican majorities and then get signed by the governor and act into law. There were, I think, 130 bills or so that the governor signed last legislative session. And there was a budget that was passed for the state to operate under. And we had 30 legislative co-sponsors on the community health center bill last year. There's so much that happens that doesn't get this big sort of hype and attention. I at least try to focus on a lot of those things and kind of look at, just as John has said, that there's so much more that I truly believe unites us than divides us on a lot of those issues, and trying to frame something in a way that a legislator can look at from a little bit of a different angle, or kind of even learn from them too, of perhaps, why does the legislator have the perspective they do? I think we could all kind of take notes from John and Mike on how to listen and learn from each other too along the way. Just want to open it up to see if there are any additional questions here. Feel free to add them in the chat. This is a brave space for questions, so feel free to ask something that might seem silly, or no embarrassment here. Otherwise, Mike and John, I'll just ask you as we wrap up here, if you have maybe just a few tips and tricks to leave us with as we are going to be coming into the Capitol to meet with lawmakers and hopefully continuing to build those relationships over time. What community health center advocates should take with them or try to do in the years ahead. I would certainly take that advice from you in your current roles and former roles as well. Mike, any particular parting thoughts to leave us with?
I would just say, do a little homework before you walk in an office. Kind of just do a little background of the legislator, so you kind of understand where they're coming from, and then lay out the case of why you're there, right? There's obviously a need, and then what is the solution that your organization has to fill that need? And then just, if there's questions that you don't have the answer, let them know you'll get back to them on it, and then do that. And then that starts that long-term relationship.
And Mike, is it always important in your mind to have a solution in place, or is it okay to kind of do more of that kind of just discussion with the lawmaker, help them understand the work that the clinic does? Or do you always have to have an ask? What's your recommendation there?
Well, I guess there's two different meetings, right? There's the inform and educate meeting, and then there's the ask, right? So if it's strictly going to be the meet and greet and you're educating, then that's fine. And then what I would do, though, is I'd always ask the legislator, is there anything that you need additional information on, so you can kind of start that process of being the resource.
Great tip. Thank you, Mike. John, parting thoughts for us, tips and tricks as we get into our legislative session here.
Take what you're doing very seriously, but maybe perhaps not yourself as much. Not that you take yourself seriously, but the issue is the most important thing. I'm going to give you an example of a meeting I had that has nothing to do with what we're talking about as far as what you guys do. So after redistricting, I picked up the Mazo Beach. And if you aren't familiar, it's part of the Wisconsin River outside of Mazomanie, and it was the new beach that was shut down. And this is a true story. I had a meeting with people who would frequent the Mazo Beach, and they wanted it to open back up again. And they referred to themselves as the non-textile community. And right there, I knew that, okay, these guys take themselves very, very seriously. But me being who I am, it's hard for me to pass up some really good jokes. So they talked about how they picked up after themselves, and they were good for the economy because they spent money, at the local places to spend money. And I said, you spent money because you don't have any pockets. And obviously that just right over their head. and my staff actually had to get up and leave the room because, you just, so, and it was also my fault for not actually properly reading the room correctly. And I shouldn't have done that, because to these, to these guys, this was a very, very serious issue. But at the same time, I'm thinking, yeah, this is an issue. It's not way the hell up there with some really, really serious issues. Not that this isn't, to them, this was a really, really important issue. And to me, I'm dealing with a million other things. And I should have taken them more seriously. So that was my fault. But at the same time, I think the issue you are working on is so important, and it affects so many people when you're successful in very positive ways. The issue is important. Don't be afraid to just kind of laugh a little bit, I guess is what I'm trying to tell you.
Thank you, John. I appreciate both of you so much for just sharing your time and your expertise with us, with advocates, this afternoon. My colleague Sashi has added a post-event survey link into the chat for our attendees. It'll take you less than 2 minutes just to let us know how we did today. We will post a recording of the conversation just for folks who have the link. So we will be sure to share that with you, and you're welcome to share it with your health center boards or other advocates at community health centers. Mike and John, thank you so much for sharing your experience, for keeping us grounded in this work that we do, and reminding us that legislators are human beings, have different motivations, are masters of none or masters of just a few things generally, and that it's kind of incumbent on us to help share the story of what we're doing and why. So appreciate both of you. Thank you, Health Center folks, for joining us today too for this conversation. Please do take the survey, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks.
All right, take care. Bye, John.
Thanks, everybody. Bye, Stephanie. Bye, Danica.